again. Here we are, everybody. This is going to be our chapter on digestion and absorption. We're continuing to build the foundation here. We talked about some definitions. We talked about some nutrition guidelines. But before we get into any of the specific nutrients, carbs, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, etc., we have to address the digestive system. After all, when we eat food, it is going to go through our digestive system, and then that is how we get the food into the bloodstream, where it can then travel to all the cells in the body. So this is a must-have chapter, right? This is how let's see if I can follow along here. When we eat the food, it's got to go through our GI tract, be absorbed into our bloodstream, and then eventually it will go to our cells. And as I said before, particularly glucose and fat, these nutrients, they're the fuel to the cells. If we want cells to work, to do their job, they need fuel. So we have to discuss the process of digestion. And, also things are digested differently. So we need to have this chapter because we need to know later when we talk specifically, hey, listen, carbohydrates are absorbed this way, and that is why they can be absorbed so quickly and provide such quick energy. Or, hey, look over here, fats, aren't they wonderful? They give us so much energy, but they take longer to digest, and here's why. All right, don't be intimidated. Mostly, we're just going to go through the GI tract. And then for each organ, we'll give a basic structure and a basic function. Here's our outline. A couple definitions first, then we get into the GI tract, and then some odds and ends. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide because I have the functions listed here. I'd like you to know all of them. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, as Cartman says, you must know all of them. Give me my cheesy poofs. Haha. Well, we first have to ingest the food. We got to have a mechanism of bringing it in. Then we our body that is, performs digestion. And digestion is just a fancy word for breakdown. Make sure you know that. Of course, the idea is we bring in something big, take a bite of a sandwich, and we digest it. We break it down into smaller pieces. Now, we can perform digestion either through physical means or through chemical means. So physical digestion would be to break down food using mechanical forces, such as chewing. Excuse me, a little ahead of myself here. Chewing is a mechanical force, and it helps to break the food down into smaller pieces. And then anytime we perform chemical digestion, we are helping to break down foods through the use of enzymes. And ladies and gentlemen, we have to use both. We're utilizing both physical and chemical digestion. Cool. Then, and these are happening mostly in order, we got to bring in the food first. Then we begin to digest it. And once we have broken down that food into its smaller pieces, only then can we absorb it. So it has to happen this way. We have to break it down first to get those big donut pieces, donuts, into smaller pieces. Because we can only absorb really small pieces. Our organs are small, right? Absorption, the way that may be helpful for you to learn this is to, move nutrients into the bloodstream. And that's the important part, folks. Because the bloodstream, now we have a network of blood vessels to take these nutrients all over the body. And then, of course, when we're all said and done, we have some waste products. We have some undigestible foods. All of those have to be defecated or removed, eliminated as waste. So make sure you can define each of these. All right, this is going to be reviewing some of the things I just said. Remember, digestion is to break down. We can do it chemically or physically. Absorption is to move those nutrients into the bloodstream. What we're going to find out is the process of absorption happens from the small intestine. Excellent. So a brief word here before we start to get into the actual GI organs. Just want to talk a little bit about hunger and thirst. I'm not going to ask you this on a test or a quiz, but you can read this information because it's kind of interesting. Once we were hunters and gatherers way back when, and we didn't have such an abundance of food, before we had a Price Chopper or Hannaford or whatever, every couple miles, it was purely physiological. We'd be hungry because our cells did not have enough nutrients. And it happens because of feedback from the body back to the brain. But in industrialized parts of the world, such as ours, for most people, having such an abundance of food, we oftentimes have overridden some of those initial feedback loops. So we've kind of lost touch with when we're really hungry. It becomes kind of a habit where it becomes something that we do, as we talked about before, right? In the first chapter, we do it socially, we do it to celebrate, we do it when we're feeling down. Okay, so interesting stuff here, but none of this will be on a quiz or exam. Here's some things if you would like to get reacquainted with your hunger and thirst for that matter, but again, not on any quiz or exams. So we're going to start to go through the GI tract. Before I do that, a brief word on taste. This kind of follows along with some other miscellaneous things. You probably know this. We have taste buds. So these little dots. There's a dot there. Boop, boop, boop. We have these taste buds. Up close, there they are, little blue guys or gals. Look at this. We have an average of 2,000 to 10,000 taste buds on the tongue. That's pretty amazing. You don't have to know that number. Taste buds is what allows us to actually taste certain flavors, which helps us to want to eat, and it helps warn us against things that are poisonous or potentially dangerous. I am not going to ask you these on a test, but it is kind of interesting. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to take that back because I would like you to know some of these. I'd like you to know the sweet one and bitter. One's in the front, one's in the back. So different regions of our tongue have different collections of taste buds. So for example, in the very front of our tongue, we have the most taste buds that are receptive to sweet. In the very back, we have the most taste buds that are really specialized for a bitter flavor. And then the lateral side, we have salty and sour and even umami. You do not need to know this all, just these two. But it's kind of cool, and I know this might sound lame, but you can try this at home. Take a dab of sugar and place it on the front of your tongue. Take another dab, place it on the back. Take more dabs, place them on the sides. The place where you should taste that sweetness the most is in the front. And you really should. All right, let's get to the meat and potatoes. Pun intended. Ha ha. So here is our GI tract. And we are going to take a journey. We're going to start at the top and we're going to work our way down, 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 all the way around to whatever's left, right? So as we go through the GI tract, we'll talk about the basic structure and then function. So that's what you should be reviewing. Structure, function. Structure, function. All right. it's important that we first define, well, what on earth is the digestive tract? So the digestive tract are the organs from the mouth at one end all the way to the anus at the other. These are the successive organs that food travels through. Because it's an open-ended tube on both sides. So food enters through our mouth. These are all parts of the GI tract, digestive tract. What food passes through? Mouth, into the pharynx or throat, into the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine. Whatever is left enters the large intestine, goes up and around, rectum, anus. That is the path that food takes. But there are other organs. Other organs that have an important role in the digestive system, but aren't actually part of the route of food, are considered to be accessory organs. They are outside of the digestive tract. What are they? Well, right here we have our liver. Food does not directly travel through there, but the liver is still really important in this system. The gallbladder, which sits right underneath the liver, also part of an accessory organ. And then even though it's hard to see, let me change color here. We'll go green. Behind the stomach is the pancreas. So if I were to draw the pancreas, it might look like this. It's behind the stomach in green. Very important also, but it just so happens that food does not directly pass through it. So you should know these definitions. You should know which organs are in which. All right. So here we go. I've already listed it for you once. Here we go again. You should know the order. Mouth, pharynx. Pharynx is another word for throat, but make sure you know pharynx. Into the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, anus. Know these organs in order. This is the order of the organs that food passes through. Just took a drink there. Bear with me. Okay, oral cavity. This is your mouth, folks. We don't need to get into very much about structure. You can name all sorts of things about the oral cavity. I don't think it's really worthwhile of your time to be able to say, ooh, the superior labial frenulum, the palatine raphe. You don't need to know all these specifics. We just know the oral cavity. It is the mouth. But I would like you to know its functions. So this is where we have taste. We already mentioned the taste buds. This is our point of ingestion. We do have the aid of saliva for lubrication, but more importantly, we have mechanical digestion. We chomp our teeth up and down, chewing to mechanically break down food into smaller pieces. By the way, the fancy word for chewing is mastication. You don't have to know that, but if you want to sound smart to someone, the process of mastication. And your oral cavity or mouth will do mechanical digestion for all nutrients. I think you know that. No matter what you put into your mouth, carbs, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, whatever you put into your mouth, you're going to be chewing all of it. So mechanical digestion of all nutrients. There is some chemical digestion. And the only thing that can be chemically digested in the mouth is starch. That is it. Starch is a type of carbohydrate. And we're going to find out later, starch is such a complex carbohydrate that we really need to get going on breaking it down soon because it's complex. So therefore, we, in the saliva, have an enzyme that can break down starch. So we can get the process going early. All right, so mechanical digestion of all nutrients, chemical digestion of starch only. We do have all this saliva. We have 3 salivary glands. You do not need to know them. in case you're wondering, we have one here, these yellow things. That's the parotid salivary gland. We have a submandibular salivary gland. And then we have a sublingual salivary gland underneath the tongue. The idea of saliva is to moisten the food. Isn't it much easier to break something down if we add some moisture? Absolutely. And of course, that saliva also contains the enzymes to help chemically break down starch. Now, I'm not going to ask you this number, but I'm just pointing out it's a lot. I mean, you think about like a 2-liter soda bottle from the grocery store. In the course of a day, your salivary glands produce about 1 to 1.5 liters. We produce a lot of saliva. It really helps the digestion process. All right, good. So after we leave, let me go back to yellow. After we leave the mouth, food is going to enter the pharynx or throat. I've put the area of the pharynx in this black rectangle. But now that I have this fancy pen on my iPad, I can say the pharynx is right here. It's a tube. It's your throat. Pharynx. So what is the function of the pharynx? Passageway. So there's no digestion occurring here. No digestion. It's just a passageway. So right after the mouth, after we swallow, food is going to make its first part down into the digestive tract through the pharynx. All you need to know about its structure is that it is lined with muscle. So the outer edges of the pharynx is lined with smooth muscle to help us swallow and begin to push that food down. Once the food enters the pharynx, that food stuff takes on the name of a bolus. We're going to see that this food mass will change names at some points in the GI tract. So after we swallow, that moistened, somewhat digested food mass is called a bolus. Now, we're next going to see the food continue from the pharynx into the esophagus. And the esophagus is a larger tube, right? I think we've all heard of the esophagus. It's a larger tube. But there's an important structure at the junction between the pharynx and the esophagus. And the structure there that we're talking about is the epiglottis. Because what we see, we have the esophagus. It's kind of in the back. Right in front of it is your trachea. Right? And just let's put it all together. Air is going to be traveling down your trachea to your lungs. So we need a separate tube for the air. But then the food, we want to go down the esophagus to the stomach. So we have a separation here. The upper part of the pharynx can have both. So this area right here can at some times have food, but it can also have oxygen and air coming in. So for this part of time, it's a shared passageway, the pharynx, for both food and air. But of course, we get to a point where we have a separation. And we have a gate, and that is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is this structure right here. When we are not swallowing, which is most of the time, even if you eat a lot, you're probably still not swallowing most part of the day. When you're not swallowing, the epiglottis is up. And that's fine. If we're not swallowing, we can keep both of these open. We don't have to worry about food going down the wrong pipe. So when we're not swallowing, the epiglottis is up, It's a piece of cartilage, it's flapped up, and air can easily make its way into the trachea. However, when we swallow, and here you can see the bolus of food, this brown thing. When we swallow, the epiglottis comes down. And what it's doing is it's closing off the trachea. So immediately after we swallow, the epiglottis moves into a down position to cover the trachea. So for that instant, the food has nowhere to go but down the esophagus. This is really important. All right, good stuff. Now we get down to the esophagus. So we had the mouth, then we had the pharynx, and now we're into the esophagus. Long tube. It is covered with smooth muscle. Where does it say that? It's a tube, muscular. Similar to the pharynx, the function of the esophagus is to act as a passageway for food. There's no digestion occurring here. It's just a passageway for food, and it moves down pretty quickly. This esophagus is going to lead right into the stomach. What's cool, if you look down here, this is a cross-section of the esophagus. Very thick walls of muscle. That's some thick muscle. And when you're not swallowing, the opening is rather small. In fact, a lot of times the esophagus will kind of flatten when there's no food in it. But when we do swallow and bring food down into the esophagus, it will expand, and much of this area will be open for the food. I want to mention sphincters. At various places between digestive organs, we have something called a sphincter. And the purpose of the sphincters is to help regulate movement. Let's first establish what a sphincter is. Here it says a collection of muscle. I like to use the phrase enlarged. So let's look at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. At the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. Well, guess what? We have something called a lower esophageal sphincter. And what that is, these arrows are pointing to it. It is an area where we have a thickening of the muscle. Now, to be fair, there is smooth muscle lining the entire stomach wall. It's just thinner in other places. When we talk about a sphincter, it's an enlarged area of muscle. It's a thickening of that muscle. And when these muscles are contracted, it blocks food. So food cannot get through. So this is how the sphincters regulate. They can stay contracted and they can prevent food from going down. So for example, if you are not swallowing, this sphincter is going to be closed. But when you swallow, now we want the food to be able to move from the esophagus into the stomach. So when we swallow, these muscles will relax a bit and allow the food to go through. But once the food has gone through, these sphincters will tighten again. Because we don't want the stomach juice to come back up into the esophagus. So all throughout our digestive tract, we have these thickenings of muscle. And they act as regulation. When we want them to, they are relaxed to let things go through. When we want them to, they're tightened to not let things go through. You do not have to know specific names of them, but the idea. When they'd be open, to let things through, and when they would be tightened and controlled to prevent things moving backward or likewise too quickly through the digestive tract. Okay, in the esophagus, the process through which we push the food down the esophagus is called peristalsis. I'm pretty sure everyone's heard of this. This here is the esophagus, right? And there's rhythmic contractions where at one time, this area of the smooth muscle contracts. Well, actually, I'll be more consistent with the drawing. Let's say this area of the muscle contracts, and then it relaxes, and the food gets pushed. And then we have another contraction, which pushes the food further. And then we'll have another contraction, which pushes the food further. So we have rhythmic contractions from top to bottom that will push the food down. This is an involuntary process, which is a good thing. You don't have to think about peristalsis. It does it for you. Even though your initial swallowing is voluntary, pretty quickly your esophagus will take over. And I love this picture of the X-ray. It's a real lateral side view. Look at how flat the esophagus is when there's no food in it, but then how much it can expand when we have food in it. And this is what we would expect to see. You take gulps, you swallow a gulp, and it makes its way down, and then it gets continued to be pushed down through rhythmic, smooth muscle wall contractions called peristalsis. Alrighty. We are already making our way down to the stomach. So we ingested our food through the mouth. It went into the pharynx, into the esophagus, and now we are on into the stomach. All right, let's talk about structure. The stomach is kind of J-shaped, right? Its structure, if we look up close, so in the top right, that's a real human stomach, right? If we were to magnify the stomach wall, if we were to take a microscopic sample of the stomach wall, and we wanted to magnify that, of course, we would see that much of the stomach wall is made up of muscle, as is pretty much every wall of a GI organ. But there are some unique things about the stomach. Microscopically, we have these depressions. And these depressions are called gastric pits. Kind of makes sense. Gastric means stomach. Pits means, well, a pit. And these are really important because this gives us more surface area. So all the little itty bitty cells that line these pits, all the cells that line these pits can produce things for us. They secrete gastric juices. Particularly, they secrete hydrochloric acid, as well as other digestive enzymes. Our stomach is a juicy place. We need the juice for the enzymes to chemically break down stuff. We need the juice for the lubrication. And these gastric pits allow a place for all those cells to produce those enzymes and hydrochloric acid. Now, what did we call the food when it was in our mouth and freshly swallowed? Further up, it was called a bolus. But now, once we get into the stomach, now the food is called chyme. It's not a very pretty word. I feel like it pretty accurately reflects what chyme looks like. Soupy mixture. So there's so much more water. The bolus is a little bit more firm. By the time I get down to the stomach, it is indeed very soupy. But that is by design. All right, so we talked about the structure, that it was J-shaped, that if you look up close on its walls, of course, there's smooth muscle, but we also have these depressions called gastric pits. And those gastric pits contain cells that secrete enzymes as well as hydrochloric acid for us. Okay, let's talk about functions. One function of the stomach is to store food. I'm not going to ask you this number, but FYI, food tends to stay in the stomach around 2 to 3 hours, but it depends on a whole lot of factors. But food's got to stay in the stomach a while so the stomach can do its job. Well, what else does it do? Well, the stomach walls churn, and they churn quite a bit. And the purpose of that is to mechanically digest the nutrients even further. We began a mechanical digestion in the mouth, but we really need to get these nutrients down into their smallest pieces. So we do a lot of mechanical digestion, and that is the case for all nutrients. And lastly, we can do some chemical digestion. We have some enzymes present. More specifically, we're able to do chemical digestion of protein. It's a similar reason as to why we started with the starch early. Protein is a complex molecule, so we need to get a head start. No absorption. We have another sphincter at the end it's called the pyloric sphincter, between the stomach and the small intestine. That's a good picture of the enlargement of the muscle. And the bottom picture here shows you that churning motion of the stomach for mechanical digestion. All right. We have made our way all the way down to the small intestine. And actually, I forgot to ask you a question. When we talked about the mouth, then food makes its way into the pharynx, then it makes its way into the esophagus, which then goes into the stomach. I'm not going to ask you this question on a quiz or an exam, but usually people ask me when I have this class in person. I think it's pretty cool. How much time do you think it takes to get food from the mouth into the stomach? How much time do you think it takes to get the food from the mouth into the stomach? From time of swallowing into the stomach? I think you might be surprised, folks. Probably somewhere around 5 seconds. It does not take long. After you swallow, it goes pretty quickly. And then, as I said, maybe an hour or two is how long the food sits in the stomach, so it can be mechanically chemical digestion of protein. All right. Now we're going to make our way from the stomach into the small intestine. All of this here is the small intestine. It is considered to be small because it has a small diameter, but it is much longer than the large intestine. So it gets its name small intestine because it's small in diameter. However, it's much longer than the large intestine. Technically, the small intestine has 3 regions. The beginning region is what we are most concerned with. Only from about here to here. That's it. The beginning, I think in the real body, it's 6 inches maybe. That region is called the duodenum. Some people say duodenum. I say duodenum. The beginning of the small intestine. This is really important. We're going to talk about this more later, but I still want to say it here because the more times we say it, hopefully the better it sticks in. Why this region is so important is because this is where the enzymes and other goodies from the accessory organs enter. So what we're going to find is that beginning region of the small intestine, let's say it's from here to here. So why that's so important, the duodenum, is because all the enzymes and goodies from our liver enter the duodenum. All the goodies from the pancreas enter the GI tract at the duodenum. So it is the emptying point. It is how juices, secretions from the accessory organs get into the small intestine. Really important. Now there are other regions. There's the jejunum, which is the middle region of the small intestine, and then the ileum, which is the most distal or last region of the small intestine. Now, if we look up close, this is what the small intestine wall looks like up close. So here's the small intestine. Well, if we take a look at the wall under the microscope, it has all these hairs. These hairs are called villi. And guess what? Even each villus has hairs. Each little villus has little hairs. It's kind of hard to see, but it almost looks like fur. If you look carefully, all these little areas have little fur. Those are microvilli, even smaller hairs on the hairs. The whole idea here is we just maximize surface area. You know, the small intestine has a lot of work to do. That's why it's so darn long. And even though it's really long, we still have to have all this extra surface area, because we're going to be doing a lot of chemical digestion. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the organ for absorption into the bloodstream. Okay, so I'm giving you the functions of the small intestine in order. Number 1, complete chemical digestion of all nutrients. Now, we began some starch digestion in the mouth. We began some protein digestion in the stomach, but that's it. So it is here. And now that we're in the small intestine, we're below the duodenum, we're in the jejunum. Now we have the enzymes from the liver and from the pancreas. Because what did we say? We said that this duodenum, that beginning region, was so important because all the secretions, all the enzymes from the accessory organs dump into the GI tract here. So it is by design. Now that we have all the chemicals we need, well, of course, now we can perform chemical digestion of all the nutrients. And then, and only then, can we do absorption. And that's to move the nutrients from the inside of the small intestine wall in across the small intestine wall into the bloodstream. This is the only organ that absorbs nutrients. And don't forget, we're absorbing nutrients into the bloodstream. Now, I know this is kind of a pretty bad picture over here, but I'm just trying to make a point. Bear with me. Let's say that all these little colored squares are nutrients. So inside the small intestine, we've got a bunch of nutrients, the green, the blue, the red, maybe it's carbs, fat, and protein. We need to get these nutrients across the villi of the small intestine wall into the bloodstream, which will then be able to leave the small intestine and go to a blood vessel so it can be delivered all throughout your body. And how do we do this? Diffusion. Movement of particles from high to low concentration. On one side, let me erase this. On one side of the villus, we have a lot of nutrients. We just broke down a bunch of food into nutrients. So in the small intestine, we got a bunch of nutrients. So what happens is these nutrients diffuse from higher concentration here, and they line up against the villus, and they diffuse from higher concentration inside the small intestine wall to lower concentration in the bloodstream. It is pretty Cool. Now, in addition to peristalsis, we've already talked about how the how the esophagus does that rhythmic contraction to push food through. There's another technique of movement of food through the GI tract, and that is called segmentation. Here it says sloshing. I think of it also like a churning. So if we talk about peristalsis is more linear. We will contract the muscle here, then we'll contract the muscle here, then we'll contract the muscle here, ultimately, which pushes the food down. But in the small intestine here, now we do some peristalsis in the small intestine, but we also do a lot of segmentation. These are supposed to show arrows like around. So now instead of just going in a linear direction of pumping food, now we kind of turn it. We twist it, we churn. And the benefit of twisting, that turning, is that it really smushes, that's a technical term, it really smushes all these nutrients up against the villi. So that churning really pushes all of the food stuff up against the walls of the villi, and that really helps us diffuse, to absorb that food into the stomach, into the bloodstream, excuse me. Okay. All right, I'm going to pause here. We're going to this is the first half of the video, and then come back for part 2, where we'll finish the chapter.